By Luke chapter 14, the crowds are coming to Jesus from all over. And it's easy for us even today to think that a great crowd would get Jesus or convince Jesus to soften his message. But it doesn't. In fact, when we look at Jesus' teaching and his preaching, sometimes when Jesus has the biggest crowd, he preaches the most convicting message. You see, Jesus was not concerned about the size of the crowd. He was concerned about the commitment of the crowd. And that's exactly what we see Jesus doing there in Luke chapter 14. Great crowds, the text tells us, are following Jesus. And at this point in his ministry, people are traveling from all over to see what Jesus has to say. His approval ratings, as we would say today, are sky high. But Jesus isn't influenced by them. Instead, here in Luke chapter 14, our main text today, in fact, we're going to camp out in Luke chapter 14. We're not leaving it. Jesus makes three statements. Three statements that challenge us today to count the cost. Three statements that ask us or force us to answer one simple question. Have I counted the cost? And some of us are probably sitting here thinking, well, of course I have. I've been baptized. I'm sitting here on a Sunday morning in Seattle, Washington, or the greater Seattle area. Of course I've counted the cost. It's not easy to be a Christian in the Pacific Northwest. But is it possible that we've settled for casual Christianity? A form of Christianity that Jesus did not have in mind. Because that's what Jesus discusses and explains here in Luke chapter 14, where he makes it pretty clear that following Jesus is costly. Let's go ahead and start by reading the text there in Luke chapter 14. Beginning in Luke chapter 14 and verse 25, Jesus has this to say to us about following Jesus. Now great crowds were traveling with him, and so he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, his wife and children, brothers and sisters, and yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross cannot come after me and be my disciple. What Jesus says there is hard. It's hard for all of us. Because Jesus is demanding total commitment. He wants us to choose Jesus over family, Jesus over possessions, Jesus over our job, Jesus over everything. We don't always want to do that. Yes, we want to go to heaven. We want the blessings of a relationship with God, but sometimes in our life, we aren't ready. We're not willing to make that sacrifice. But that's exactly what Jesus challenges us to do there in Luke 14. He wants us to count the cost. He wants us to make that sacrifice. You see, in our own lives today, we don't always serve God with all our heart. That's been our focus this weekend. Serving God with all of our heart. As disciples of Christ today, we want to make sure that when we come together as a people, when we're out and about in our own daily lives, that we are serving Him with everything we have. But what we need to realize is that if we want the blessings that God offers, the forgiveness that He supplies, and the salvation that He gives to us, then we need to count the cost. We need to serve Him with our whole heart. And the interesting thing about what Jesus is telling us to do here in Luke chapter 14 is He's not asking us to do something He Himself has not already done. He's asking us to count the cost. Jesus counted the cost. Jesus paid the price. Jesus gave His life there on a cross so we could be saved. And in return, He asked us 2,000 years later to make that sacrifice. He wants us to make that commitment. What Jesus says here in Luke 14 gets at the core of what it means to be a disciple of Christ. That the cost of discipleship is high. And at some point in our life, making the decision to follow Jesus is going to make life hard. We're going to face choices, we're going to face challenges in our life that we never saw coming. We're going to be forced to make a decision that we really deep down don't want to make. We're going to be forced to answer this question in our own life. Is following Jesus really worth it to me? And that's the question that Luke 14 puts in front of us. And when I look at Luke 14, one of the things that jumps out to me there in the text is found there in the first two words of verse 26. If anyone. What Jesus says here in the text is not just for religious leaders. What Jesus says there in the text is not just for the apostles. What Jesus says there in the text is for all of us. That if we want to follow Jesus, we need to listen to what Jesus has to say here in the text. But what Jesus says there would have come as a big shock to them. Because Jesus is telling them there in verse 25 that they need to hate their family. They need to hate their mother. They need to hate their father. They need to hate their brothers. They need to hate their sisters. They need to hate their own spouse. And that would have shocked them. And perhaps it even shocks us today. But in the ancient world, the family was the most important relationship. You did not turn your back on your family. And we still have a little bit of that today. Family's still a pretty big deal today. If you don't believe me, just tell your mom or your dad or your brother or your sister that you're not coming home for Christmas and let us know how that goes. Family is a big deal to us. But Jesus tells us there in the text that if you want to follow me, I have to come first. He makes it very clear, as the screen says. There is a relational cost that we must pay to follow him. That's the first statement Jesus makes there in Luke 14. We look at what Jesus says there and we go, Jesus, that sounds a little harsh. I thought I was supposed to love my mother. I thought I was supposed to love my father. I thought I was supposed to love people. But now you say I have to hate them. What gives? I'm a little confused. But what Jesus is teaching us here in the text is that our love for him must be so great that everything else seems dull. Jesus needs to be first in our heart and in our life. That's how we serve God with all of our heart. You see, when we compare our relationship with God to everything else should be no comparison. It must come second. See, Jesus knows here in the text that we're going to be tempted to try to choose Jesus and family or Jesus and friends. But Jesus says you can't do that. It's not one or the other. It's me or family. That's the choice that we all must make there in the text. But do we believe what Jesus actually says there in the text? Because Jesus is telling us that he will not share our heart. He will not share our affection. He will not share us with anyone else. He wants our whole heart. This is one of those areas that is so easy for us to compromise. Because we don't want to disappoint our friends. We don't want to disappoint our families. So we try to serve Jesus in those relationships. And it's so easy for us to do that. It's so easy for us to love our spouse and love our kids more than we love Jesus. And we do that by spending so many hours at the ballpark. Or we spend so much time at band concerts. And we spend our time and our energy and our money at all these events with our family, and they're great things we need to be doing sometimes. But sometimes we're so tired from the ball game that we don't have the energy to spend with God's people. We show that relationship is more important. We will make it a priority to be with them more than we make it a priority to be with God. But Jesus is honest with the crowd, and He's honest with us. He lets us know up front how much it's going to cost. That if we make the decision today to follow Jesus, if we have made that decision to follow Jesus, it may hurt our relationship with our spouse. It may affect our relationship with our parents or our grandparents. It may affect our relationship with our friends. And my guess, a crowd of this size, in this area of the country, there are some here this morning who have had to pay that relational cost. Your friendships, your relationships have been severed. But for the rest of us, is this a price we're willing to pay? If our spouse comes to us one day and says, it's Jesus or me, what are we going to say? Because Jesus makes it clear here in Luke 14. Our love for Him must be so great, so sure, and so important that any other relationship seems insignificant. Can I say that? Can you say that? Can we look at our life and our hearts today and say that Jesus is more important, the most important relationship that we have? Because that's the kind of loyalty Jesus deserves. That's the kind of loyalty Jesus demands. But Jesus doesn't stop there. There in verse 27, He goes on to say, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Of all the things that Jesus could have said, Jesus tells the crowd, take up your cross. What Jesus said would have horrified everyone in the ancient world. Whether you were Jew or Greek, slave or free, it didn't matter who you were in the ancient world, you did not talk about the cross. The Jews believed it was a curse. The Greeks said it was the worst way to die. You did not bring up the cross in a polite conversation. And yet here Jesus, as He stands before this great crowd, says, if you want to come after me, you must take up the cross. 2,000 years ago, the cross was not something you cross-stitched on a pillow or hung around your neck. It was a cruel way to die. But that's how Jesus describes the life of a disciple. And He says this because Jesus is not looking for fans in the stands. Jesus is looking for people who are willing and able to carry that cross. The life of a disciple is not a life of comfort. Jesus tells us the second statement here in the text, that there is a sacrificial cost that we must pay if we want to follow Jesus Christ. And yet, sometimes in our own society today, we have people who will say, well, that's just my cross to bear. And to an extent, I get what they're saying. We have things in our life that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And usually when we say that phrase, well, that's just my cross to bear, at least back east, they're usually talking about that annoying coworker, that annoying in-law, outlaw, family member, whoever it may be. Maybe it's a disease, but that's not what Jesus is talking about here in Luke 14. When Jesus talks about carrying a cross in the first century, it meant that you were a dead man walking. Whatever hopes, whatever dreams, whatever goals, whatever aspirations you had were gone. We just kind of sung about that in one of the songs we sang just moments ago. To carry a cross meant everything was over for you. You were about to be humiliated. You were about to suffer. You were about to die. And yet, when Jesus describes the cost of following Him, that's exactly how He describes it. He's telling us that what we need to do is we need to think about what we're doing before we follow Him. That following Jesus is not something we do just because we're in a tough spot. Following Jesus is not something we do just because it'll make our girlfriend or our boyfriend happy. It's not something we do because our parents will be happy. It's something we do after sitting back and calculating the cost. Here in Luke 14, Jesus is telling us very clearly that following Him will affect my life. And that we need to decide right here, right now, what are we willing to pay? Are we willing to make that sacrifice? Am I willing to do what Jesus wants me to do to serve Him with all my heart? Because discipleship requires sacrifice. There are no exceptions. And remember, when Jesus says these words, He's not talking just to the 12 disciples. He's not talking to the Jewish leaders. Remember, He's saying, if anyone. What Jesus is saying here in the text is He is talking to us. He is talking to the crowd. That we no longer live for our hopes and our dreams and our goals and our desires. They are gone. They're over. That if we are a disciple of Christ, we die to self. And Christ now lives in us. But I think sometimes we may have watered down what Christ really wants from us. That maybe we've watered down that gospel message to 5 simple steps that we talk about sometimes. And I get why we do that. We're trying to simplify the gospel message. But the gospel message is more than 5 steps and get wet. The gospel message requires so much more. It requires sacrifice. It requires us to pay the price. And that can be a real challenge for us. You see, we're willing to give Jesus a little time on Sunday. We're willing to give Jesus a little time on Wednesday. But guys, that's not bearing a cross. That can easily become checking a time clock. That's casual Christianity. That's Christianity without commitment. Jesus demands more. Jesus deserves more. He died for us. He wants us to live for Him. He wants us to pay the price. And that's hard. But sometimes in our life, we really like Jesus, but we aren't ready to commit to Him. We want to follow Jesus, but we don't want to pay the sacrifice. We want enough Jesus to save us, but not enough Jesus to change us. But Jesus demands more. Jesus tells us that's not enough. Jesus tells us that discipleship requires sacrifice. And if we aren't ready to sacrifice everything, we cannot be His disciple. Following Jesus is a life of self-denial. Jesus is not backing down. He does not water it down. He tells us the price up front. It's not like you go to a car dealership and you see the list price and you kind of haggle with the sales guy and you get it down for a little lower. It doesn't work that way with Jesus. He lets us know up front what it will cost, and we have to answer the question for ourselves. Am I willing to pay the price? In fact, there in the text, Jesus goes on to use really 2 illustrations to talk about the importance of sitting back and counting the cost of following Jesus. And He begins to do that there in verse 28, where He says these words. For which one of you, wanting to build a tower, doesn't first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? Otherwise, after he has laid the foundation and cannot finish it, all the onlookers will begin to ridicule him, saying, "This man started to build and wasn't able to finish." Or what king going to war against another king will not first sit down and decide if he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If not, while the other is still far off, he sends delegation and asks for terms of peace. In the same way, therefore, every one of you who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple. You know, those 2 illustrations are really interesting to me. That first one, that cost of building a tower. You know, in Chicago, there's a big pit in downtown Chicago. Where years ago, about 15 or 20 years ago, I believe, someone made this plan to build the tallest skyscraper in Chicago. And I think it's actually the tallest skyscraper in the Western Hemisphere. And they got started and they dug the pit for the foundation, but guess what? They went bankrupt. They went belly up. And so now, some 15 years later, there is a big pit in Chicago that is a daily reminder that someone started a project, but they failed to calculate the cost. They failed to say, you know what, it's going to cost us this much money. I need to make sure I have the financing for it. I need to make sure I can afford it. That's what Jesus uses. That's the illustration Jesus uses first there in verse 28. And the second illustration is about a soldier, a general, who's getting ready to go off and to fight a war. And he starts to do the math and go, wait a second here, I'm a little outnumbered. I have 10,000, he has 20,000. Am I really ready to fight this battle? You know, today, at least in the TV shows, they'll talk about a force depletion report. That if they're about to do some military activity, they're about to conduct an operation somewhere else, the president will say, I need a force depletion report. How many soldiers can I reasonably expect to lose if I get involved in this military operation? That's what the text is talking about there. Presidents, builders, whoever we are, we all take time to count the cost of buying a house or building a skyscraper or going to war. Whoever we are, we always take time to count the cost. And that's what Jesus wants us to do ourselves. And all of that leads up to verse 33, where Jesus drives his point home one more time. And he reminds us that if we aren't willing to renounce all of our possessions, we cannot be his disciples. That if I am not willing to sign over the deed to my house, the title to my car, I cannot follow Christ. And I have to believe that some of the disciples may have been a little puzzled by what Jesus is saying here in the text. Up to this point. I mean, after all, he said, hate your family. What are you talking about? Bear a cross? That's a cursed thing to do. Why would you tell us to do that? And then finally, the third thing he says is you got to renounce all your possessions. You got to be willing to give everything up. They have to be sitting there thinking, Jesus, what you're saying here is not how you win friends and influence people. People like their money. People like their stuff. People like their houses. They like their cars. But that's kind of the point there in the text. That we can only follow Jesus on his terms. And that if we aren't willing to pay the financial costs, then we cannot be his disciple. That's the third statement Jesus makes there in verse 33. You see, everything in life has a price tag. That if I want to learn guitar, and I tried to dabble in guitar about 10 or so years ago. If I want to learn how to play guitar, I need to be willing to not only pay the price for the guitar and pay the price for the guitar lessons, I need to be willing to invest the time and the money and the resources to practice. And if I want to get a latte on my way to work, stop by Starbucks or one of the local coffee shops here in the area, guess what? I need to count the cost. Am I really willing to pay that $6 or $7 or $8 for the cup of coffee? Or do I want to make it at home in the Keurig? What am I willing to do? If I want to be a disciple of Christ, Jesus says you need to count the cost. That we must be willing to give up everything. Our money, our home, our cars. We must be willing to give up everything to follow Christ. That's the challenge that Jesus puts before us here in the text. He wants to ask ourselves if we're willing to do that. Because Jesus knows that we can't serve God in money. He talks about that a little bit in the Sermon on the Mount. Right there in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is getting really to, I think, the climax of that message. There in the text, in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24, Jesus says, no one can serve two masters. No one. Since he will either hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. That's the message that Jesus has for us. And it's easy for us some 2,000 years later to go, well, Jesus, you have it wrong. I can't. I've got it figured out. I can serve God in money. But Jesus goes on to explain why we can't. Why it's such a struggle for all of us. You see, Jesus knows that where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. That where I spend my time and my money and my resources and my energy reveals the true desires of my heart. And if my focus and my energy and my desires are focused on accumulating as much wealth as possible, then that's going to get into the way of me serving God. And I think that's one of the reasons that Jesus spends so much time in his ministry talking about money. Because Jesus knows that money and what money can buy can easily become an idol. And this should be a huge wake-up call for all of us. Because we are insanely blessed in this country. We are fabulously wealthy, every last one of us. But it's even possible for those good things in our life, those blessings in our life, to become God things in our life. For the blessings that God has given us to end up being the very thing that pull us away from God. And it's easy for us to think that following Jesus is okay as long as it doesn't interfere with my life. But following Jesus gets a whole lot harder when we think about what Jesus is telling us here in the text. That he wants us to give up everything. But we aren't the only ones who are told to give up everything. This morning in our Bible classes, we looked at Mark chapter 1 and the call of the disciples. And when the disciples were called, we saw there in Mark chapter 1, they left everything. They left their homes. They left their families. They left their business. They left their jobs. They left everything behind to go follow Jesus. And that's exactly what we are called to do. If we were called to give up everything, if following Jesus meant losing everything, would it still be worth it to us? You know, there's this passage over in Hebrews chapter 10 where the Hebrew writer is describing some of the early Christians and encouraging some of those early Christians. And he says, look, some of you, in Hebrews chapter 10, have rejoiced as your possessions have been taken away. You're watching someone confiscate your house. You're watching someone confiscate your car. You're watching someone confiscate your prized possessions. And these early Christians were rejoicing as that happened. Why in the world, how in the world could they rejoice as everything they've worked for, everything they've shed blood and sweat and tears for has been taken away? How can they rejoice? They could rejoice because they've counted the cost and they realized Christ was worth it. Do we have that attitude? If we lost everything because of Christ, could we rejoice? You know, for the longest time in our country, being a Christian was the easy thing to do. But that's starting to change. In fact, here in the Pacific Northwest, you guys know how hard it is to be a disciple of Christ. It is much harder here to be a follower of Christ than it is in other parts of the country. And it's that way because our society is turning away from Jesus. But there's going to come a time in our life where we're going to have to make the choice between maybe our job and Christ. We're going to have to choose between losing everything and following Christ. And in that day, what will we choose? Followers make the sacrifice. Disciples are willing to give up everything because they know following Jesus will be worth it. Here in Luke 14, Jesus makes it clear to the crowds, and he makes it clear to us even today, that he is not interested in half-hearted, self-seeking disciples. Jesus wants disciples. He wants followers who are willing to pay the cost. He makes it clear that following Jesus is costly. And we need to do it with all our heart. And the only way we can do that is if we count the cost. Maybe you're here today, and you've been sitting here and you've been counting the cost of following Jesus, and you are convinced it's worth it. Maybe you're ready to say, I'm ready to lose my home. I'm ready to lose my family. I'm ready to lose my friends. I'm ready to lose everything because of Jesus, because I know that relationship with Christ is infinitely more important. I know that home in heaven will be worth it. Maybe you're here this morning and that's where you are, and you're ready to pay the price. We would love to help you with that while together we stand and sing.